can start. Yes, we can? Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Lourdes, and I'm with the Mob Language Services. Tonight, we will be providing for you interpretation into English and Spanish and Creole. So for those who do not speak English, the session will be in English. We have interpreters available that can translate into Creole and into Spanish, what's going on in this space. So we also have our sign language interpreters for those of us who are not able to speak or hear properly. So we have everyone covered. This is a way for PAMM to bring everyone at the table and really reflect the diverse background of the city of Miami where we live. So if you are not able to participate in English and would like to listen in Spanish or in Haitian Creole, please, upstairs there's a gentleman that is there with those little gadgets where you can put in your ear and listen into your chosen language, Spanish or Haitian Creole, and listen and participate as everything else is being done in English. So we ask you to go up there, please, or raise your hand if you would like to listen in Spanish or Haitian Creole. It will bring you a little device that you can use in your ear, and so you can listen in the conversation in the language of your choosing. And if you'd like to participate in Spanish and listen in Spanish, it's going to be on channel 1, and for Haitian Creole, it's going to be on channel 10. And thank you all for your participation, and thank you for being here with us tonight. And bonsoir tout le monde. Nous sommes c'est Lourdes avec Mob Language Services et à soir toute une équipe qui là qui est disponible pour faire interprétation pour nous dans la langue créole haïtienne ou bien dans la langue espagnole. Donc si vous entendez en créole haïtien ou bien en espagnol, n'a pas d'autant pris aller en haut, n'a pas monsieur Ala disponible pour les banons équipement pour nous mettre dans les oreilles nous pour nous attendre en créole haïtien ou bien en espagnol, je nous t'arrête là. Donc canal 1 c'est pour espagnol et puis ça canal 10 c'est pour créole haïtien. Donc c'est une façon pour nous mettre tout le monde à table là, quelle que soit la langue où tu parler. Donc c'est une réflexion, un reflet de ville Miami côté nous vivre là. Nous disons déjà merci et puis ça bonne participation. Now in Spanish.
Buenas tardes. Estamos aquí, mi nombre es Aidil, estoy aquí con mis colegas Lourdes, Aline y Camilo para proveer interpretación al español y criollo haitiano para aquellos que se sientan más cómodos en esos idiomas y quieran escuchar la presentación en ese idioma. Estamos con Mob Language Services cumpliendo el compromiso de PAMM de hacer justicia lingüística y que todos puedan participar en su idioma de preferencia. Si prefieren escuchar en español, pueden subir arriba o levantar la mano. Aquí mi colega Willy tiene el equipo que les pueden proporcionar para que escuchen, se lo ponen al oído para escuchar en español, es el número 1. Y así pueden escuchar todo lo que está sucediendo al tiempo, simultáneamente interpretamos. Muchas gracias por su participación y que disfruten del programa.
Okay, we're going to get started. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Perez Art Museum, Miami. Thank you for joining us both here in person and for those of you that are watching live on YouTube. This program also will be available post-program online, so if you have folks you'd like to share it with, you can also send them the link. My name is Marie Vickles. I'm the Director of Education, and it's my pleasure to kick us off for tonight's public education program, presented by PAMM's Caribbean Cultural Institute, which we like to call CCI. It's in partnership, this program tonight, with the University of Miami's Center for Humanities, Center for Global Black Studies, and the Department of English. And we are thrilled to present an in-depth reasoning on the styles and fashions that have made Jamaican dancehall music one of Jamaica's many iconic cultural exports around the globe. Professor Patricia Saunders of the University of Miami and Professor Donna Hope of the University of the West Indies, Jamaica, we'll discuss the wisdom and dangers inherent in the confusion of the Jamaican colloquialisms fashion over style and sell-off in contemporary global markets. During this fantastic program, we will be treated to a special presentation at the end of the discussion of bespoke poetry by Dr. Kai Miller, a writer and professor at UM's College of Arts and Science. Leaning into Professor Saunders' book, Buyers Beware, Insurgency and Consumption in Caribbean Popular Culture, the conversation will also challenge stereotypes around the aesthetic practices of working poor and working class diaspora peoples, explore the significance of stylizing the Black body, and question the lack of attention to these practices. We are looking forward to our speakers examining how contemporary artists intervene in global commodification dynamics and perhaps offering us a fresh perspective on agency, performance, and freedom within consumer culture. And speaking of consumption, we have the book for sale in our bookshop tonight only. So I encourage you to get down there right after the talk if you would like autographs by Dr. Saunders herself. So I know I'm going to get one. A few acknowledgments before I introduce our speakers. For those of you that were fortunate enough to hear the sounds of DJ Jason Panton on our terrace just a bit ago, lucky you. A shout out and big thank you to Jason. Please pass that on to him for setting the vibe and sharing his musical talents with us this evening. And of course, a very special thank you to the Andrew Mellon Foundation that has provided the support for the establishment and ongoing programming of the CCI, the Caribbean Cultural Institute. I would also like to thank the incredible, all caps, team of people working to produce our PAMM education programs. I would like to acknowledge Anita Bram, Associate Director of Adult and Public Programs, David Miller, Education Coordinator, and our world-class audiovisual team, Denise Faxis, Andrew Bird, and Lázaro Yanes on videos and cameras. We could not do these programs without their support and help, so thank you all. All right, let's talk a little bit about our featured presenters. Dr. Kai Miller is the author of 11 books that range across genres, fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. He is interested both in that movement between genres and between creative writing and literary scholarship. In 2014, he won the Forward Prize for poetry of his work, The Cartographer Tries to Map a Way to Zion. Additionally, his novel, August Town, won the Bocas Prize for Caribbean Literature, while his collection of essays, Things I Have Withheld, was shortlisted for the Bailey Gifford Prize. He has also written several essays of literary scholarship in the field of Caribbean literature. Professor Miller joined the English faculty at UM in 2021 and previously taught in the UK at the universities of Exeter in London and Glasgow. Professor Miller has an MA in creative writing from Manchester Metropolitan University and a PhD in English literature from the University of Glasgow. His dissertation examined the epistolary tradition in West Indian literature. Dr. Donna P. Hope is a professor of culture, gender, and society at the University of the West Indies. Her work engages with Afro-Jamaican Caribbean cultures of identity making as they intersect with power domains, including class, gender, and race color. Professor Hope has published extensively in the areas of popular culture, gender, music, identity, and creative industries, authoring and editing 6 academic books and 1 self-published popular book. Her most recent publication, titled Dancehall Queen, Erotic Subversion, Subversion Erotica, edited with Carla Lamoy, was published in August of 2023. This bilingual work historicizes the dancehall queen phenomenon in its engagement with music, dance, and fashion, and assesses the movement of this female-focused cultural force regionally and globally. Professor Hope is a former Deputy Dean of Graduate Studies and Research and a former director of the Institute of Caribbean Studies, where she organized and chaired 4 international reggae conferences. When I read that, I was like, wow, that's awesome. A keen cultural activist with a deep interest in Black working class culture and a researcher with a strong ethnographic focus, Professor Hope is the founder of the Dancehall Archive and Research Initiative. Another wow there for me too. It's dancehallarchive.org if you want to check it out. It preserves, innovates. This site is meant to preserve, innovate, and disseminate information about dancehall culture while working with dancehall actors and researchers locally, regionally, and internationally. A renowned social commentator and former talk show host, an itinerant newspaper columnist, Professor Hope is finalizing her poetry monograph, These Thorns Have Roses, for publication. She's also completing the final draft of her manuscript on the spread of dancehall's dance industry under the title Dancehall's Scattered Children, as well as her work on the transitions in Afro-Caribbean gender structures, tentatively titled Transitory Masculinities. And now, Dr. Patricia J. Saunders, our very own, is the Professor of Hemispheric Caribbean Studies and Director of Graduate Studies in English at the University of Miami in Coral Gables, where she is the co-editor of Anthurium, a Caribbean Studies journal. She is the author of Alien Nation and Repatriation, Translating Identity in Anglophone Caribbean Literature, and co-editor of Music, Memory, Resistance, Calypso and the Caribbean Literary Imagination. Her second book, Buyers Beware, Epistemologies of Consumption in Caribbean Popular Culture, examines a range of contemporary Caribbean popular cultural modes of expression that argue that the bonds between consumption and citizenship in the region are stronger now more than ever, despite higher rates of unemployment and socioeconomic inequity. Her work explores the intersection between performance, visual art, music, film, literature, and consumer culture in the Caribbean region. Buyers Beware was published in 2022 with Rutgers University Press. So some incredible folks we have here tonight. We do hope to have time for questions following the program. So if you're joining us online, just a word, put your questions in the comments section of the chat. And now, without further ado, because we could go on, please join me in welcoming Dr. Saunders, Dr. Hope, and Dr. Miller.
Testing.
Testing, testing. Thank you all for coming out on this Thursday evening in Miami. I know this is the official start to the weekend, so I'm quite honored that you all are decided to kick off the weekend with us here at PAMM. Thank you for coming.
Echoing those sentiments, and of course also welcoming those who are joining us on social media, on YouTube, by the links online. Welcoming everyone who is joining us to share in the dialogue and the discussions around Pat's book and around Caribbean popular culture and the transitions and changes that we are looking at in this era. So we start.
Yes. First of all, thank you. This is a conversation that's been a very long time in coming, so I'm thrilled that Donna decided to join us in Miami.
Yeah, and I'm thrilled. I had the honor of writing the first review of this book. I had my copy. I left it on the desk, all filled with Post-it notes. You know what it looked like, right? We should put a picture up.
I'm going to post it on Facebook this evening. I've never seen a book with so many Post-it notes
I read it from cover to cover, every word.
Thank you.
Yes.
So we start.
Yes.
Do you want to go first?
Well, in a lot of ways, and Pat, I know you had been working on this project for some time because there's that chapter that you did, a paper that you did that came through in the book, which my students had a lot of fun with. I know everything good for eat, good for talk, and I want you to start, by kind of speaking to that in terms of how it becomes a part of the conversation that you have in Bias Beware. I know everything good for eat, good for talk. Yes.
So that's there are no minors in the audience. So
Provocative.
it's a very provocative title. So how would I translate not everything good for eat, good for talk?
Well, and Jamaican language is very full of double entendre. It's full of a lot of, ways that we lock a lot of information inside of metaphors and that. So it isn't everything that is good to eat. Is also good to speak about in polite circles, because I think that's really what it's saying.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
But it also is talking about other kinds of eating in the way that you reference it.
Yes.
And so tell us about it.
It's almost a quadruple entendre, right? Because there is the business of quote unquote airing dirty laundry, right? So the things that you consume in your household, you don't necessarily go out and talk about, be it food, be it the body in sexual conversation, as it were, fellatio. I mean, I think about, the book is about consumption.
Yes.
And I read consumption in the broadest possible sense, right? The consumption of food, which that's what the chapter is actually about. And funnily enough, I wrote that chapter, it might have been 15 years ago.
I think it was 1999? I'm sorry. Yes.
It was long before my first book even came out. But it was an essay that was just nagging me. And at some point, I wanted to not publish my first book and write the second book. And I was warned against that. It was a sure way to never get tenure and all of those other things. So I decided the best way to kind of feed that desire was to publish this essay and send it out into the world, and then return to the first book manuscript. So I did that, and ironically enough, I workshopped it quite a bit at a number of conferences in Jamaica, and there's some interesting anecdotes. Every time I would show up in Jamaica, people would come to the talk and say, "Are you one to talk about, them a bow?" And bowing is a colloquialism for oral sex in Jamaica. And
usually, and more so for cunnilingus,
yes,
as opposed to
cunnilingus,
right?
yes.
Because of the way that Jamaicans have conversations with the female body, and the way that the female body part is either celebrated or denounced, depending on the kind of positionality that it is taking in the conversation.
And at the time when I think the reason the essay was plaguing me was that this was the turn of structural adjustment that was having a tremendous impact actually on the agricultural industry in Jamaica, on, poor people food suddenly became, food that no one could afford, certainly not poor people, not middle-class people. And I remember one dancehall artist saying, that the national food went from ackee and saltfish to Jackie and saltfish, right? Because there was this idea that with structural adjustment, women became more powerful in the economic market, not necessarily because they were making more money, but there were more opportunities because of offshore, the movement of the clothing industry, sewing, the information sector, all of these jobs that were moving from the US into the Caribbean region were jobs that were gendered in the sense that they were jobs for women.
For women.
And so with that came a certain economic independence that women had not enjoyed previously. With that economic independence, some people felt women were more bold, more brash in their desires and in their demands in relation to their male partners, right? And so there was this very public conversation about, how the country was being, all pun
And this was
intended.
before social media, so the conversation was more, legacy media, traditional media, the terminologies we use now, and also on the ground and in the music, in dancehall music as well.
So that's the thing. I mean, the dancehall music is the opinion page, right? It's like Calypso in Trinidad, right? If you really want to find out what's happening in the country, you listen to music, right? Because you get it raw, you get it unfiltered, and quite complicated critiques, right? I think that people tend to minimize the kind of impact of popular culture, and that's one of the things That's one of the reasons I decided to focus so intently on popular culture, right? That it really is a very sophisticated, well-informed, in many more ways than I think academia can be, about and around questions of consumption and consumerism in the popular vein. So, I mean, I grew up listening to dancehall music in DC, right? It was the music of choice in the 80s. And, you know, because I had kind of recently come from Trinidad, my ear was still attuned. Growing up in DC, we still lived in a Jamaican Trinidadian community. So I grew to appreciate, you know, the brilliance of Jamaican patois, because people tend to say Trinidadians have a way with words, but I think Jamaicans have a way of
Thank you for that, but I don't want the Trinis in the house and online to stop you from, take your Trinidad. But so you're giving us in a lot of ways, because that question in a lot of ways giving us an understanding of the kind of the germination process for Buyers Beware, because this is something that has been coming for a while. I mean, we've been at conferences together, and so when the book arrives and the way that you blend in a lot of, blend the kind of the different forms of Caribbean popular culture, Jamaican popular culture, foregrounding a lot of Jamaica, but also pulling in other forms of popular culture from Haiti and Trinidad. And I want you to speak a little bit to the process of that before we get into some of the actual forms that you pull through the book, because you blend into that process these Black popular cultural forms that in the conversations historically have not really been lifted up and raised up in such a fashion to make them as valuable and as valid and as important, but you pull them together, tease them out, and then also showcase the kind of consumptive but also power from below conversations that are taking place within these commodified forms. So tell us, just share us in a little bit how that comes together. How do you find that process of pulling together these very related strands but still coming up, poetry, music, fashion? Give us a little part of that conversation.
Many years ago, when I was a graduate student, I came to Miami for a 6-week course where I took a course with George Lammy. And I remember him saying that nationalism is expressed first and foremost through the palate.
Yes.
And I remember that stayed with me for years and years, right? To think about what that means to express nationalism through the palate, right? Food. Food is one of the ways that we communicate, very much so in Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Black diaspora, right? Food is one of the ways that we tell our stories. It's one of the ways we situate ourselves in relation to larger traditions globally. And so for me, it was a natural, if you think about, let me taste your saltfish. There's a whole history of food being the paradigm through which Caribbean people express history, sexuality, gender and class difference. But also, I think what was striking to me in the time when I started thinking about this book was the extent to which structural adjustment was kind of decimating the economic systems within Jamaica more succinctly than I think Trinidad, because Trinidad has oil money. And so I think that the impact wasn't as immediate or extensive. So to me, it made sense, right? That every time I listened to a dancehall song, it was about food, imported, right? People eating apples and peaches and, these
Kellogg's.
Right? The importation, because it was easier and cheaper to get food from abroad than it was to grow food in Jamaica, right? So for me, I should preface this by saying my first degree is in agriculture. Right? So I've always been a person that's paid great attention to the production of food and what the production of food means. So as I'm, listening to this music, I'm thinking, I was introduced to the work of Danny Laferrière, who's a Haitian writer who had been living here in Miami for a long time. And much to my surprise, his work was slowly getting translated because I'm more of a Spanish speaker than French. And here's this man writing countless novels about the black body, but also the consumption of black body. But again, through the guise of food, right? And popular music and song. And what's interesting with Laferrière's work, which made it seem the sensible inclusion in the book, was that he was writing about youth culture. And I said, for all the books you read about Haiti, there are very few books that situate the Duvalier period through the eyes of young people. we always read about Duvalier through the eyes of adults. And here is Dany Laferrière in Le Goût de Jonfil and Heading South, all of these books situating it, in the parties, in the dance halls, in all of these spaces, and looking at that experience of Duvalier through the eyes of teenagers. And that completely disrupted what I thought I knew about Haitian popular culture, right? And so in that way, he gave me a way to think differently about consumption and agency, most importantly, in that vein. So, that's how Haiti makes it into the book. But then, of course, you talk about Carnival in Trinidad, right? Again, food is, in a way, an easy vehicle to talk about consumption in the Caribbean. Mm-hmm. And not just in terms of the foods we cook and eat, but the way food can become a weapon and the way food can be withheld in times of economic distress, what is available, what's not available. There are countries in the Caribbean where almost all of their food is imported, right? Where there's no agricultural sector. So even the availability of food, for me, just made perfect sense as a vehicle to think about consumption practices.
And I don't want the audience to think that the book is really a book on culinary cultures, because you're grounding the food argument so solidly. Mm-hmm. All right, so it's because of course it's a consumptive activity that you're really referencing through your analysis and connection to these conversations about culinary culture, and of course bringing into it that kind of understanding of the impact of structural adjustment, especially in the 1980s and onwards, where Jamaica still stands as a specific case study because of the way that the structural adjustment conditionalities and special terms were leveled on Jamaica first as a country in the region in the third world without any kind of adjustment for the type of economic structure that existed, and so right on the ground. And so what came out of that were many things: cultural, popular cultural, gender, the kind of activity, and that it comes up in the work that you're doing, because of course the conversations that come up in the music culture are also in conversation with and navigating around what is happening in the society in the 1980s and beyond. So there's a way that you're pulling all of these things together.
All of that together,
yes.
Because also, again, the natural jump off, so to speak,
and how North America, for example, becomes much more important in our region than, say, the UK, which was at one point the earlier destination. And so that period of time becomes a fertile space for the transformations that you're talking about in
because tourism emerges, right? And so again, as someone who's interested in consumption in the broadest sense, what happens when all of these other economic sectors get depressed? What emerges, right? And what emerges in Jamaica and in Haiti, to a lesser extent in Trinidad, is tourism, right? And with tourism comes sex tourism, right? And so there is, and I think the first people to point it out and to speak succinctly and to call it by its name were dancehall artists, right?
Yes.
So that immediately, there are a battery of songs, about people bowing and, needing to tie their laces because they felt that under economic distress, people were, particularly they were saying men were stooping, literally, in terms of practicing oral sex on women because it was a response to economic distress, right? And men were considering queer relationships because there was
transactional relationships. And I think also because before, in the earlier era, reggae music, Rastafari, we had the conversation about Renta Dreads, and we have had conversations about Beach Boys in Barbados and elsewhere, but I think it becomes more cemented in this era, post-structural adjustment, because of the necessities. So on the table, eat on the table. So instead of sitting at a table erect and having a meal, you're kneeling and stooping to eat on the table, again because of the necessities. And you've teased that out in Laferrière's work with the conversations in Heading South about the kind of reverse agency, the withholding of, or the kind of ways that people negotiate power through this sex as commodity, as power, framework that is created, this dynamic that is created out of these necessities and desires that spring up in this era. Talk to us a little bit about that.
I think that it's interesting with the Laferrière work, and I teach this often, that it's an interesting problematic because it reconfigures transactional sex in such a way that the easy interpretation is to say that, women are prostituting themselves for money. But I think La Feria turns that on its head and says, well, what if we reimagined or, reoriented ourselves in relation to power and women having the power to demand, command, and navigate, right, their bodies not only as commodity, but as currency, right, in order to work their way up and down the social ladder, whether it was through color, class, access to opportunity, access to education. It's interesting because every time I teach the book, the students are like, well, it's still prostitution, right? Because it's the only way that they can sort of imagine these kinds of exchanges, right? And I think immediately, Danny Laferre is very aware of that. So when he writes Le Goût de Jeanfille, he takes the white tourist out of the book and replaces it with the henchman, Duvalier's henchman. And they said, okay, now how does race change the way we read this story? Because it's still, in Heading South, it's young boys who are, and I mean very young boys, they're children, who are having transactional relationships with adults, white women from the United States. And that's in Heading South. In Le Goût de Jeanfille, which gets translated, Le Goût de Jeanfille is the taste of young flesh, literally translated. In English, it was translated into Dining with the Dictator. And that's a whole other conversation we can have about how texts get translated and how those translations also shift the power dynamics, because the novel is in no way about the dictatorship. The novel is about these 4 young women navigating their way through this society where their lives are kind of always hanging in the balance, right? And they understand that youth and sexuality are 2 of the major forms of capital. And they use that as their way to not just live, but to protect one another, because they realize that their parents and the previous generation can't protect them, right? So La Feria is a fascinating writer in that regard, because he really situates sex at the middle of the way all of the dynamics and relationships get negotiated in societies where the haves and the have-nots, there's a wide gap between that. I think in Jamaica it's a little bit different because, why is it different? I think in large part, most of the relationships there are they're more players, for lack of a better term.
Well, and I also think that because you speak about Heading South, and I introduced my graduate students to the conversations in your book, and they had a challenge kind of pinning down, the different mechanisms that are used to kind of bring forward this reverse agency and kind of restructuring how the power dynamics work. But I think you're also, one of the things that also should be spoken about, and again, we're talking about the commodity, the commodification, and the transactions that take place, and you talk through your work, is the way that these different cultural spaces, whether it's tourism or it's the music or it's dance or fashion, opens up in a lot of ways the spaces that were once, kind of reserved for the national, for people who are outside to participate, to partake, and therefore to also want to be a part of and to consume. In a kind of metaphorical sense, but sometimes literally, the cultures that are there, whether it's the culinary cultures or the sex work cultures, and how these are then transformed to fit into the current era. And you have to also bring in the kind of gendered conversations that you have in the work. People like Vibes Cartel. I want to talk about Vibes Cartel, because we have to bring up some of that.
Yes. I think Vibes Cartel captured my imagination because I think he transformed the landscape in Jamaican dancehall culture, right? Jamaican music, where dancehall music in particular, when it came to talking about women, it was always women in bed, bawling for mercy, slam, spread out, all of these kinds of terms. And then Vibes Cartel entered the scene. And, I have somewhere in the book, I say that he's the Pum Pum laureate of Jamaica, right? In the sense that he...
laugh, yes.
No, because it's like he elevated, in an interesting way, the conversation about female genitalia, right? Because the famous song, he has a song that says, how can I translate this?
Blessed?
It's called Ever Blessed, where he's literally comparing female genitalia to the book of Ruth in the Bible. Like, that's the whole song. And the first time I heard it, I kept pressing rewind. I literally went and got the Bible because I'm like, no, man, no, man.
And there's a little film, because the little filmic, little mini documentary that was done using the ever blessed motif to look at spirituality and religion through that same conversation, because of how he elevated the pom-pom to this reverential space.
Yeah, I mean, it's,
Yes.
you know, and again, it was, I mean, some people say, okay, you're simply perverse, but I'm like, no, this is brilliance. This is brilliance because, I mean, dancehall culture has historically been kind of dashed away as crass and, you know, ragga music, as my father would call it, whenever he heard me hearing it. He's like, you can't even understand what they're saying, right? But again, it was this way of thinking about, and I mean, he was castigated for this reverence of you know, female genitalia, because that was not in lockstep with the way the female body had been talked about in dancehall music, right? And then he was like, I don't care. He's like, you know, the fact that we are so obsessed with the female body, we need to address that, but we need to address it in a different way. And so his whole barrage of music, as I said, transformed the dancehall landscape. But in the same vein, the other thing that he did that was, I don't know if it was more controversial or less controversial, was the bleaching.
Skin bleaching.
The skin bleaching.
And I think for those who may be aware of Cartel, and he's incarcerated at DJ Palmer, one of the most prominent and dominant lyricists of the post-millennial era, and one that has impacted on the understanding that many young people of that era have of their culture and the music. And so for the skin bleaching, in terms of not just speaking it through the music, but also showing. So he was performing it and showing himself in his own representation as an artist, with his skin lightening process going on, and of course the tattoos. You know, his body is a coloring book, and pretty like a coloring book. And so he brought into the framework of the music culture and dancehall culture a lot of these other conversations and these strands that were very problematic in Jamaican society were not accepted in polite conversations, and were seen as robbing the society of what should be its strong connection to its African centrality, and, you know, kind of reversing a lot of what many persons had worked so hard for, but connected in many ways with a lot of what is going on in the contemporary era. For example, tattoo culture had never been a part of Jamaican culture. It was something that was seen as foreign and alien, even though we understand it to have many different meanings depending on where you're from. It can be religious, it can be, you know, ceremonial, it can be a part. And so these are some of the things that Cartel pulled into the conversation, as well as freshening up Clark's, and again bringing that consumptive conversation into the culture. So talk to us a little bit about.
Well, I think, you know, when I saw Vibes Cartel in the New York Times, in the business section.
Yes.
And in my reach, right? Because literally what they were talking about was what it means for a person to make themselves and their bodies into a brand, which is literally what he did, right? Which I saw that happening already in sports culture in the United States, but I thought, you know, it's still different, because in sports culture, you have contracts with Nike, you have contracts with GMC, you have contracts with big businesses. So you are not really the brand. Like, the brand is borrowing your persona, your personality, your body, your abilities and all that in order to sell a product. What Vibes did was to say, no, I am the product, right? And he, you know, had a whole line of things that began with the cake, soap, rum,
Vibes rum,
condoms, like, you know, the whole line of things. It was Vibes everything. But, you know, it was, what got me was this idea, and I'll show you a video of his famous song, Coloring Book. Because I remember very famously, he came to the University of the West Indies. He was invited to come and give a talk.
We were all there. It was in 2011.
2011, right, to talk about his kind of provenance as an artist and all of that. And, you know, so, of course, the two questions came up, both of which I was fascinated by. One was the skin bleaching. And people were like, oh, you know, you're bleaching out your Africanness and this and that. And he's like, no, man, my body is a canvas, you know, for me to write a story, a different story. And I was kind of blown away by that, because to think about, in so many ways, The skin has always been a canvas, but it's not been a canvas that we have controlled the painting of. It's been a canvas where stories are projected onto our bodies. So what might it mean for someone to take possession of their flesh in that way, with a complete awareness of what the commodification of black flesh means?
And that is the important point, because even connecting it to the sex power nexus that you talk about, it is this level of agency that is, again, is grasped and taken control of. And so some of these discourses, these activities that are seen as coming from a higher power onto the bodies of less powered people, what Cartel is doing, what a lot of the young people that, is spoken about in Heading South are really doing, is to reverse the agency and claim some level of power over who does the marking on their bodies, what these marks represent, who has the positionality, who is on top, what does this mean, as you talk about in the book, who is on top in the sexual position, but also in the conversation
about marketing and consumption,
and who owns the brand,
exactly,
what is being consumed, and who gets the returns. Yes,
I talk about this is not unique to Caribbean culture. Think about the NBA, right? There's a section where I talk about the Allen Iverson effect, right? Allen Iverson almost single-handedly was responsible for the dress code in the NBA. Right, because he was known to show up. The famous picture that I couldn't afford to include in the book. He showed up at a press conference in a royal blue fur coat and a Seattle Mariner baseball cap and just bling on his neck. It was just
fabulous.
It was absolutely fabulous. And I think about 5 weeks after that, the NBA was like, dress code, right? You can only wear hats if it's the hat of your team. You have to wear a suit. You have to wear all of these things. And, people remember that moment in the NBA, right? Because there was an effort to make all NBA players look alike, right? You could only wear the socks with the logo. You could only wear, if you were wearing a headband. And that was, I think they only recently adapted back to the headband. And so there was an interesting trend that took place after the dress code. Tattooing exploded in the NBA. It exploded in the NBA. And in large part, it was the one bodily act of resistance that would allow players to stand out from one another. So yes, we all are dressed this way. We're given some leeway in terms of the shoes because we're commodified. I'm with Nike, you're with Adidas. But the tattoos then became a way for them to tell their story, right? And you saw, not just men's basketball and women's basketball, it began to grow. And so for me, as I'm watching television, I started to pay closer attention to what was inked onto these players' bodies because it was their way of telling their story, which, to be frank, the NBA wasn't particularly interested in at that time.
But it's also, right? Pat, you're saying also, what you're saying as well is that it's also a way of resisting
Absolutely.
The kind of power that is being pressed on them for this kind of standardized representation of who they are under the ambit of the NBA or some other formal authority. And when Cartel does that kind of, rejection of the accepted codes of dress in Jamaica and the codes of how you market yourself as an individual, it's a similar kind of
as a black
activity, as a black man,
yes. Right? So I'm going to ask the folks to pull up the coloring book so that this is the thing with writing about popular culture. I can talk about it until I'm blue in the face, but you really have to see it to appreciate it.
Is it up? Coloring book.
Omar, Philip, Brando, Styles. Girl, them see me tattoo from mine. Tattoo time come. All of this space for me skin soon done. If you not have none, go get one, go get one. If you not have none, go get some, go get some. When the tattoo nigga start to run, me kill off the pain with street boys rum. If you not have none, go get some, go get some. If you not have none, go get one, go get. When the ink load up and the needle a juke, tattoo sell off, everybody have to look. Y'all say me pretty like a coloring book. She say me skin pretty like a coloring book. Y'all say them want find when me live on her book. She asks if it hot like rice we just cook. Y'all say me pretty like a coloring book. She say me skin pretty like a coloring book. Look on me skin, tattoo like dirt. Me no wear shirt, cause I in a concert. Philip of the work, till me mark up like school book. Add the new look. Gyal a said the flavor shook. Police a send me favor crook. Me ink up like the cleaner and observer. Brando the ink surgeon with the surgeon. Skin paint up like Berger. 404. Omar from Waterford. Him a lock down port more times. Push illegal through the epidermis. Hotter than a maca. I put no like a furnace. Pretty when it finish, but it hot when it a service. Moon it hear the legal go so and get nervous. From me start, me can't stop. Every day me say this for me last two. Because when me soon pass you. The angel them and the grass new. Me skin favor the wall them when L.A. Louis pass through. When the ink load up and the needle a joke. Tattoo sell off everybody a feel.
That's a Cartel signature sound.
But
yes.
it's interesting because Rick Ross has, and that's a whole other conversation about artists having their kind of unique calls, right?
Yes.
You know, the Rick Ross kind of grunt that everybody knows. This song is a stroke of brilliance. Let me start by saying Cartel pre-bleaching was the same color as I am, right? And so the bleaching process, everyone, when it first started, everyone had their interpretation of it, and there was big conversation.
Huge.
Across the country about how to read this, what this meant, you know, and you had young kids who were like, nah, man, I'm not black no more, and, you know, adults
Rejection
were
of
getting
African
of his
identity.
African identity and this and that, and it was interesting to watch him struggle because it was a struggle to control his narrative, right? Because, look, bleaching has been around. How many of you remember Ambi commercials? All right, let me see a show of hands.
Ambi commercials.
Okay, right?
Puns, but like puns.
Right.
Puns.
All of these products
Cold
that
cream.
were skin lightening creams that were used in Black American culture, in India, all over the place, right? But of course, it was seen as a beauty regimen, right?
For women.
For
we
women,
have to all,
that's
remember,
important.
the gender dynamic is important. So the theme, it was always about the feminine body and women's own desires to sort of fit into the aesthetics of beauty that the societies were pushing on them. But then Cartel is a male, hardcore, dancehall, very different.
Yeah, and so the fact that I remember when the conversation started, I was like, this could go south real fast, all pun intended, because skin lightening has historically been a feminine aesthetic, right? But it had been creeping into the dance hall in subtle ways, and then Cartel just took it to a next level, right? And I think, so, I mean, the song, you know, it says when, he's just, as a lyricist,
Well,
man
one
is
of the things that I
brilliant, you
saw,
know.
though, because the video is dated, because in the far, I think to the left, my left, the BlackBerry phone, which was then the popular phone.
Yes, so it's an older.
It's older.
It's an older
Right.
video, but in the same vein, you know, there's he says, my skin markup like the Gleaner or Berger, 404.
404.
404 is a base paint that you put on before you put color on a wall, right? So, I mean, just again, lyrically and aesthetically, the Gleaner is the national newspaper. So he is giving us an invitation to read his body, to read the signs and symbols that he has tattooed on himself as a way of reimagining. You know, we see the tears on his eye, which in American culture has one, you know, connotation. In his case, it represents dancers and people within the dancehall fraternity who've died, right? So again, even in the process of these tattoos, what he's doing is to say, no, I control this narrative, right? And, you know, how it gets read, it's up to me. It's not up to you uptown people who are deciding that I'm uneducated and ignorant and all of these other things, and this is why I'm doing this, because I'm moving away from my African heritage. He's like, no, none of that, right? I'm going to lay claim to this, and I am going to control this narrative. And I think this is a good point for us to go to the all angles
The all
piece.
angles piece, enlightening, right? the
Again, to
conversation.
get an idea of how big this conversation was, there was a huge talk show, and opinion is in the newspaper, every radio show, every TV show.
And All Angles is a primetime radio, television talk program that is aired 8 p.m. primetime.
Yeah.
I think it's on Wednesdays, and it's really very high
Yes,
profile.
it's like Barbara Walters,
Right.
but you know. So please, if you can share this,
Talking about skin light.
talking about skin bleach.
That's when I had here.
Into many spaces that you can't take plane and work or you don't have a visa. People see you.
people are getting videos and people request them to come and take part in them stage run and parties all over the world. Video light becomes very important. It's a way of sending yourself into different places. You're famous, and the television and the media industry helps us to understand you're on TV, you're famous, and if you're on TV, something happens for you. People want to be made visible in that way, especially when they live their lives locked in all these little boxes that we have created in Jamaica called inner cities and ghettos and poor communities.
You're not.
And so in that conversation, there was a documentary that was done for the All Angles program where we're talking, Dion Jacksonville and myself are in conversation, and then she's pulling in women and men who are bleaching their skin to explain why they're bleaching their skin, what it means for them. And so the fashion over style, that particular term comes up a lot. People are talking about it being fashion, representing themselves in dancehall culture and inner city culture and working class culture as fashionable people, but also speaking about what it means when they enter the party scene in dancehall culture, and how the people who are videoing, and now we'll talk about streaming, going live, would position themselves in the center of these videos because they are more visible, they are more beautiful, and so they are given this shine that pushes them into a level of recognition and visibility that is often denied to them in the society because of who they are and how they are positioned on the socioeconomic scale. So they are given more power because of the way that they are made more visible through skin bleaching. I had locks. This was, again, a little while back, so I had more hair then. But so there's a huge conversation in the society because many individuals were troubled by what they saw as a slide into practices that were ripping apart the kind of center of a society that had been pulled together, for example, in the 70s, with the understanding that we are people coming out of a history of colonialism and slavery, and we have to recognize our Africanness and hold it firm. And here we are in dancehall culture, in working class culture, in the inner cities, rubbing away that understanding and taking away the melanin and trying to represent differently. So we went through a lot of conversations in this particular documentary, trying to understand from what the work on the ground, and I did a lot of ethnographic work with people on the ground as well, because in my work I go and speak with people where they are to get a clearer understanding. Are you rejecting your African self? And talking through what African selves mean, but what selves in this period, 21st century, means to the people who are living their lives on a very day-to-day basis and how they make meaning of it. So the video light is very connected, as Cartel tells us, to how you are made more visible and how you can show yourself. And you pull a lot of that into Buyers Beware.
And I think that's the critique of skin bleaching has always been a top-down critique, right? It's uptown people making pronouncements about poor black people who are uninformed, and that's been the narrative, right? But it's also a pushback to this fervent nationalism that was supposed to bring everybody up, but it didn't, right? And so there are people rejecting out of hand these middle-class aspirations, right? So in the same vein, the uptown people come into the dance hall because that's where the vibe is. They want to partake of the culture, but in the same vein, castigating these different aesthetics and these different practices. So for me, there was something bracketing all of the medical research and the sociological research, because all of that gets talked about in the documentary. And I want to bracket that to say, okay, what might it mean to think about? And a number of the practitioners, that's what I call them, people who practice skin bleaching, were talking about the fact that, you go for a job interview and people see, where you're living, and immediately that disqualifies you from the job. But if you walk in and your skin is a little lighter, they're more inclined to overlook the neighborhood that you're coming from, right? Because you present in a different way, right? And so it's also calling out the colorism, and the way in which Jamaican society has always rewarded, in many ways, light skin. To think about light skin as something you could turn on and off changes the playing field, right? And so that is a way of reimagining agency. And I know people have said to me, that's a very romantic notion. And I said, yes and no, right? It's never either or, because, again, middle class and upper middle class people have controlled the narrative for so long that when that narrative gets rewritten, and it's interesting, it's not just in terms of what skin means, but a lot of my research comes out of the visual arts culture.
Yes.
Right? So Polaroid was never intended to photograph black skin. Right? It's not until the late 70s, early 80s that photographic technology begins to understand the prism that will allow black skin to be shown in its full brightness, right? In the light, so to speak. This is that taken to an extreme almost, right? Because again, when he talks about the aesthetic, about the base paint, he's talking about the way in which the flesh, particularly black flesh, has always been hypervisible on the one hand and invisible at the same time, right?
But when he also brings the Gleaner, which is our national newspaper, the first newspaper, he's also bringing in also the telling your story, bringing the information through the canvas of the skin that he's using. So writing your own
literally
narrative
right?
on the
And he
skin.
talks about the coloring book. He says, you know, in a coloring book, you know, when my daughter was young, she always colored everybody in rainbow colors, right? Everyone's skin was like 8 colors. And I'm like, you know, well, pick a color. She's like, why? You know, I thought it was a peculiar way of envisioning, you know, how people looked. But in essence, that's what Cartel is saying, right? Is that I am choosing to color my life in this way. And, you know, one of the things, the other question that came up, which was priceless to me during that conversation, was that someone asked him if he sold his soul to the devil in order to have the success that he had as a dancehall artist, right? Because the kind of fame and recognition that he was experiencing far exceeded that of most dancehall artists, right? And he was fairly new on the scene. And I remember he made a joke in passing about, he's like, how does one do that? Do you put an ad in the paper? Sold for sale, you know, please inquire within. I mean, he made a joke of it. And yet at the same time he was making this joke, the earthquake in Haiti happened around the same time. And very infamously, Pat Baker on television, national television, said that the reason the earthquake happened was because Haitian had made a pact with the devil in order to gain their freedom. This was on television. And so when I heard that, it took me back to that conversation because there has been, that narrative has prevailed in a number of situations within Black diaspora culture. There's the literati, right? So people say Jay-Z and Beyonce. So wherever there are these narratives of Black success, however configured, it's immediately turned, it's like the only way this can be translatable is that there has to be some quote-unquote dark science, right? There's some deal with the devil made. And I actually dig into that a little bit because Cartel is a very, very bright man. He understands the power of signs and symbols. So you'll notice there's actually an eye of Horus,
right,
on his pectoral muscle. And if you pay attention, he actually has a Freemason's ring on his hand in the music video, right? And so there are all of these ways that he's not shying away from that assertion, but he's saying, no, I will be the person to interpret for you what these signs mean. You can believe what you want to believe, but ultimately my understanding of Freemasonry, which has a very complex history within Black diaspora culture around emancipation and free Blacks, if you follow Masonry culture, it's fascinating, right? I tried not to go down that rabbit hole, but there was no way to not pay attention to it because it was part of and people say this about LeBron James and all of the successful basketball players. And so there's a kind of way for me as well that narratives of Black success get perverted in these interesting ways around, you know, what I hate the term Black science, right? Obeah, voodoo,
dark
and all
science,
the
dark arts,
right?
Yeah.
But I think, you know, there's a way that his appropriation of his, I mean, I can't call it, it's his body, it's his skin, right? The way that he pulls everyone in, he shifted the narrative because after a while, people really said, okay, like, you may not agree with it, but what he's doing pushes our comfort and understanding and comprehension well beyond what we think we know about ourselves, about our blackness. Right. And he really forced a conversation, not just in terms of skin, but also about sexuality, right? In a way that made many people very uncomfortable.
And I think, Pat, that we're still talking around bias beware, because right, and so in bias beware, I think one of the things that you do with the different cultural forms that you pull together is to show how this kind of resistance politics, because that's what it really is taking place in different ways on the body, across the body, but also within the popular cultural forms. The poetry, for example, you talk about Ebony Patterson's work, and some of that is also having that similar conversation. So tell us, because you talk about the poetry, some of the literary forms that are pulling this conversation. So Vybz Kartel becomes a central motif, and Jamaica is very important.
He's a very important character, but figure, right? But he's also, I found the continued conversation between dancehall artists and visual artists.
Right.
It's there. Dancehall itself has always been, from the fashion to the lyrics to everything, its own aesthetic, right? And I think the work of Ebony Patterson, which many of you may be familiar with, Ebony has done large exhibitions here at the Perez. And, very early, she begins to think about, her work has always been concerned with Black visibility and Black bodies, right? And at the same time, this hyper-masculinity that makes Black men ultra-visible and yet invisible at the same time when you think about the way in which they're constructed socially. And so one of the projects that she began working on before she did the exhibition here at the Perez was about visibility in death.
Right.
Which is one of the things that, and I think this is, again, not unique to the Caribbean. I think it comes out of African cultures and the way funerary practices are carried out. But Ebony Patterson had this, way of trying to get us to think about why Black people tend to practice the kind of funerary rituals that they do, that basically say, you may not have seen me in life, but you will see me in death.
So they are kind of cultures of excess in a lot of ways that reimagine the departed, the dead person, in larger-than-life postures, and also pull a lot of eyes into the conversation with the funerary practice, because it's seen as, going over the top, bling. We talk about in Jamaica, bling funerals, stylized, and showcasing not just the body, but all the practices around it for
all
the
of
eyes,
all of the ritual involved in. It's almost as if, there's a way that all of the things that were denied in life get brought into the scene of death, right? And it's not just about, these are the things they never acquired, but we have this chance to give them the send-off in death that they never got in their living, right? In terms of being able to live their fullest self.
Celebrating the life. Right? Well, celebrating the life that they have lived.
And more typically,
more to come.
The life that's been cut short. Yes. Because many of the times, these are people in their teens, in their 20s, that are dying, right? So the next video clip I want to show, it's a fascinating project that Chris Cozier, who's a Trinidadian artist, invited Ebony Patterson to Trinidad to do a kind of site-specific installation. And this is where some of that work begins. Some of the work that we see later here in the Perez actually begins in Trinidad and Tobago. So
this is the Alice Yard project.
Yes, this is the Alice Yard project.
It's quite easy to talk about a problem, but it's an entirely different thing to decide to do something about it.
This place has too much guns. This place has too much guns. Pity-pata, pity-pata. Can you tell me what's the matter? Pity-pata, pity-pata. Awake, arise from the sleep and slumber. Pity-pata, pity-pata. Can you tell me what's the matter? Pity-pata, pity-pata. This place has too much guns.
My work has always dealt with, or my work has always explored dancehall signage. And so that you know, that more or less means the aesthetics. I pull aesthetically from dancehall culture, from bling culture. And when Alice Yad had invited me to come here to do a project, I decided that I wanted to come to Trinidad and respond quite honestly to what was happening here, without coming with. I tried very hard not to come with any preconceived projects. So I didn't come with any materials. I just came on Wednesday night, and then on Thursday, the person I'd been staying with, Ashraf, had taken me downtown, and Chris Cozier here, sitting beside me, taken me downtown to, you know, get familiar with the kind of materials I might be interested in using, and just getting a kind of sense of what the city's pulse is like. And I can remember when I was in Samaroos looking at pearls and the glitter and the, you know, the things that kind of entice me. Hearing a woman lamenting about somebody who had an announcement that had just come over the radio about somebody being killed. And it's something that has stayed with me, and it's something that I felt that was repeated over and over during the course of my stay here. The sense of concern and genuine concern about the state of crime in Port-au-Prince, rather, in Trinidad, and then also too, coming from a very similar experience in Jamaica, where our crime rate is you know, almost as equally as high. We were once the murder capital, and now things have shifted. So there's kind of an understanding. But I felt that I felt like there was a sense of urgency here. So what we're gonna do is, there are 9 coffins. So there are 4 places for each person to hold. And so what we want to do is, we want to invite persons to come and to take our coffin. And we're gonna exit the yard. We're gonna walk up Robert Street towards Carlos, up to Tragreet, around Tragreet, down Murray, and we're gonna keep walking down Murray all the way to Adam Smith. We're gonna go around Adam Smith, come back up Carlos, and then back onto Roberts, back to the yard. We're going to be led by our sound system in the front, in true bling funeral fashion, or true bling funeral procession. We must have a sound system of some sort, or some loud vehicle, keeping the posse moving.
July 14th, 2011. Commissioner Francis Brown was shot dead while returning home on his bicycle on Tuesday. Round 65 was found bleeding on the road by residents who went outside to investigate a loud explosion.
So we are just ruminating on, because this happened in 2011, and what occurs in the first decade of the post-millennial period, 2010, 910. Jamaica is undergoing a lot of different tensions and pressures. So we had the Tivoli incursion, when Dudus Coke is being sent back to,
Being extradited,
sent
actually
forward to the
yes.
USAB, and that's May 10, it's in May 2010, and a lot of activities going on. Ebony actually reflects on that in a piece of work she does, which she inserts inside of the Carnival March, right, and then she comes to Trinidad and does the
But I think she actually starts with the bandanas, because part of
first, yes.
So a quick and dirty, Dudus Coke is a very famous, infamous drug don. And at some point, the U.S. decided that he needed to be extradited to come and stand trial here. And Dudus took refuge within one of the poor...
Well, there's is a very powerful, and I write about this in some of my work, in my Man Vibes book on masculinities, but it's the strong power connections to the political party, in this instance, the Jamaica Labour Party, and a strong power base in Tivoli Gardens in that community. So when he is requested from by the US of A. There's a lot of resistance, and he pulls together henchmen and men from all over Jamaica to come and barricade.
To barricade
and so there's a
himself.
horrid time that happens in Jamaica where, the U.S. sends troops and they're out there, and the Jamaican government has to respond. Bruce Golding was the prime minister at the time, and it's a Jamaica Labour Party government. So there are a lot of implications for how the political power, which is connected to the dance
Absolutely.
historically,
And
is
the
now
culture.
having to, and the culture and the music and the youth culture and masculinity is connected. And so 2010 into 2011, Vibes Cartel, the dance hall, the
All of this is
bleaching.
happening at the
It's a
same
very, very, very fertile and very tense time in Jamaica. So a lot of what comes out, and Ebony does a lot of work at that time, reflecting on masculinities, on violence, on death, and we are writing and doing a lot of research. And so this pulls into, so Dudus is eventually extradited after a huge battle.
Huge battle.
A
where
Labor Day in Jamaica.
60
A lot of people died.
lot
Some
of
of them
people
are not yet
are not yet found.
found.
They
right.
just were disappeared.
A lot of young men died, but it also
and
ripped
there,
apart.
but there are no
yes.
bodies, right? So
It's a hard
Ebony
time.
Patterson first erects a public monument on bandanas. That's the canvas that she uses, where she insists that we must keep these missing dead visible, because the Jamaica Defense Force, the U.S. government, everyone, it's as if they weren't there, because of course, if there are no bodies, how do you mourn? Where's the closure? I mean, what happens when you literally disappear an entire life? So she erects a monument where she, puts, they're not the faces of the missing people, but she puts faces on bandanas to
yes.
keep them. And I mean, even today, we're talking more than a decade later, people don't know where these bodies are, right? They've
And many
never-
persons still haven't been able to claim or identify
Any of them.
this. And it's men. We're talking about a lot of very young men. It's all a conversation as well with Jamaican masculinities and how genders are, through the violence and through these violence-producing cultures, are then implicated in different areas and also are disappearing into non-spaces that they can't be rescued from. So this work also speaks in a lot of ways with Ebony's work, with the talk through dancehall and the discussion and debates about Black masculinities, Caribbean masculinities, Jamaican masculinities, Haitian masculinities, Trinidad, and the cultures of the way the cultural forms converge.
Converge, yeah. And I think visual, which for me brings the book, kind of full circle, because this project, so it begins in Jamaica around the Tivoli incursion. A year later, she goes to Trinidad, and there's a spate of killings in Trinidad, and she begins to design decorative coffins, but invites, through Alice Yard, through this art activation, where she invites people into the community. I think she makes a coffin for every person that's killed while she's there, and she's only there for about a week. And so she talks about being in this ambivalent space where she's hoping no one gets killed because she doesn't really want to do this project, and yet the project relies on the death of these. And so in the end, when you see them, parade, and it's interesting, as they're walking through Port of Spain with these coffins, the police pull up and begin to interrogate them about what they're doing, because funerals are not held at night and all these other things. And so, part of the point of the activation was about the visibility of the dead, but you can't see these same people when they're alive, right? And so that's 2011. I think Ebony's show at the Perez, it's pre-pandemic.
This was pre-COVID.
It's pre-COVID,
Yes.
so I feel like 2015, 2016. So you begin to see how that project then grows. And the coffins then become pyres, funerary mounds, with glass sculptures, disembodied glass figures that are hidden in this beautiful, lush, I spend a lot of time coming to the museum and watching people watch the art. It's one of my favorite things to do. And there are all of these people doing photo ops with the art as the backdrop, not realizing that they're dead bodies buried in this plethora of beautifully colored flowers. And that's precisely her point, right? Is that there's a way that the disposability of the Black body, particularly Black masculine figures, gets, disappeared, even in that context. And so one of the things that struck me about her exhibition here was the kind of invitation. In order to see it, you really had to peer into the exhibition piece in order to see the dismembered bodies. And as I was finishing the book, I kind of stumbled upon this amazing poem by Kai Miller, which was literally responding to. And it was interesting watching a lot of people when they came out of that exhibition. There was a video in the back that I'm going to ask them to show while Kai is reading. A lot of people came out of the room, the video room, the exhibition Three Kings Weep, crying. People went in very, again, because there's a shift in tone. It's a small room, but the video installation is massive. And I watched over the course of about a month, people go in and people come out in tears. And the majority of the exhibition is actually silent, except for the recitation of Claude McKay's If We Must Die. And so I want to invite Kai to come to the front and read his poem. And I'm going to ask the AV folks to run the video of the Three Kings Weep. I don't know if you, okay.
After Ebony G. Patterson's While the Dew is Still on the Roses. Here where are the bodies, spectacularly jeweled, and the bodies, spectacularly jeweled. Observe them, each one a catalogue of fine sewing, back-tack, cross-stitch, tent-stitch, made by women with hands as sure as surgeons. Here, where are the hairpins? They glitter like dew on the roses. Goodison reminds us, to us all flowers are roses. And hair, where is the hair? A braid dance hall red, now abandoned, as if it had freed itself from one head duly conked. The Neanderthal pull of a man. Hair, where you must bear witness to what the hair had closed its eye to. The black cloud of shoes, the sound hymning between the leaves. The day thou gavest, Lord, has ended. The darkness falls at thy bequest. Hair that is not holy ground, but just a hole in the ground, the funereal mound. Hair that pulls the tears back into the soft bodies of boys. And observe them, their soft and spectacular bodies, their spectacular bodices, the spectacular corsets, the spectacular corpses. I want so much to say this, that our bodies are spectacular, and not the harder truth that our bodies are spectacles, or deaths blossom like roses in the dark garden behind the house.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
I'm going to take a minute.
We take a minute. And I just want to say that I've been following Ebony's work since she was finishing at Edinburgh in Jamaica. And she has always had this interest in black masculinity, black male bodies, but in a lot of ways showing them in all their opulence, even while they are also shown in poses that oftentimes speak to some of the problems and the problematic vulnerability, right, that they have to exist within in the worlds in which they are placed, whether in their own territories or in the minds of others who have more power over black bodies than sometimes bodies have. So I think this particular exhibit would have been connecting to the funerary cultures of the region, where we do spend a lot of time as black people celebrating in a very opulent fashion, the dead, the departed, but also the body of the community that is connected to this departed. So we have to always take a minute, because Ebony's work does invoke and evoke the kind of understanding of the broader themes that are connected to these bodies.
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. And I think, I finished the book during the pandemic on the heels of George Floyd's murder, on the heels of Ahmaud Arbery's murder, and I could go through a whole list. Literally, I ended the book with that. And this video, this scene has captivated my thinking about what the possibilities are for the visibility of Black subjects, right? And so I'm working, the next project, is tentatively titled, Must They Die to Be Visible? And it's an exploration of Black subjectivity in the contemporary visual landscape in America. And I think
that we have covered a lot of ground in the work. So, I mean, and this is the book I see some persons have already acquired their copies at the front. So I think what we're going to do now, Pat, is to pause, have a little sip of water, and open the floor maybe for a few comments or a few questions.
Questions?
Yes, maybe a one or two, because it's like, maybe a question or two from the audience. Thank you. Buyers beware.
Hi, good evening. Thank you, everyone, for supporting this. I took some notes, and I thank you all for being here. We're focusing on the men and the visibility, but I just wanted to bring up, and I wondered, and forgive me for not knowing in the book, the consumption of the body, and you mentioned, this sort of come consume me, and I think about the resurgence or the discovery of dancehall queens from the 80s that is coming up with young people now. And at the same time in the 80s, Luke Skywalker and the women of Miami were exuding this same sort of confidence and saying, yes, consume my body, like this is my body. That was happening at the same time in Miami-Dade County. I feel that Black women were doing the ultimate in feminism, in showcasing their power and owning their sexuality, but many times they were even shunned in their own community. So you talked about taking possession of the flesh, and while Vybz Kartel is quite controversial, he's upheld for saying, yes, consume me, this is me, while women still can't, quote unquote, own their brand. Do you speak about that at all? And show of hands, anyone had Batty Riders? Batty Rider shorts. It's because you looked up to a dancehall queen.
Yeah.
And I just want to thank you for that point, because we are talking directly to past books, so we didn't go off into some of the, because we are limited time, but my work has been in talking through dancehall culture and doing work. I just published a book. It's called Dancehall Queen, Erotic Subversion. It's a bilingual book in Spanish and English. It's available online, Amazon, or from the Dancehall Archive. I actually brought a couple copies here, but this is Pat's night, so I wouldn't. No, seriously, because I'm talking with the students at tomorrow. So I have a couple copies here. If you would like to have a copy, that would be lovely, because the point she's making, and I do agree, that in the way that gendered structures and patriarchal cultures work, men are celebrated in a lot of ways for doing things that the women have been doing for decades. And so Dancehall Queen, there's a big upsurge now where we're looking at dancehall feminisms and activism and the rebellious women in dancehall. So that work is coming out of that, and we are doing a lot of work with that. But we're talking up to Pat's night, so we really would be pushing that. But I have some of those books.
We didn't get a chance to talk. I have a chapter called Outer Door and Outer Order,
yes,
where I look at none other than Lady Saw. And, my anecdote about writing this book, when I started, Buju was a free man. And then I had to revise the first chapter when he got arrested. And I was like, good, it'll be out before he gets out of jail. That did not happen, right? So I had to do an afterword about the concert. But I talk about Aishana and Spice, right? The infamous, what's the song Aishana did?
Equal Rights.
Equal Rights, the famous repurposing of the Burning Spear song again, which caused a tremendous amount of controversy. And then Spice, to your point, has this song called, why am I forgetting?
Which one?
If I Was a Man.
Oh, Like a Man.
Like a Man.
Spice,
where
like
she literally, someone is interviewing her, asking her if they think she would have gotten more of a profile if she was a man. And then the whole video is her styling herself like Vybz Kartel. And basically writing her version of a Vibes Cartel song with all of these female dancers.
she's performing
around.
she performs
She's performing
masculinity.
and she says at some point, the only difference is that we have, you know, breast and a vagina. I mean, literally, that's what the song is about. And she talks, you know, she does this kind of register of all of the things that male dancehall artists have been praised for. And she does similar things, but then gets castigated for it, right? So I do spend a whole chapter writing about that because, as you say, there's a way that, you know, it's turned. And, I mean, Spice is another one who calls Jamaican society out about bleaching because there's a scene. She kind of crossed into pop culture. Ah, there it is. So, yes. So this is the video where, let me see.
Oh, the audio.
That's
goes,
so
right.
the person in the seat is actually Spice.
And she calls herself Splice. So
Splice.
this is S-P-L-I-C-E.
Right. So she literally fashions herself and says, okay, if I were a man and did these things, may I get ratings? You know, she said, you know, would I get more ratings? So I do, in fact, as I was writing the book, I don't want to call it misfortune. Lady Saw found Jesus just when I was about to finish my chapter. And just, I was like, seriously?
She's still in dance. No, but she's still in a kind of dancehall.
She is
So, Kiss Out My
performing for
Bible.
Jesus, yes.
Kiss Out My Bible is speaking to Christianity, but again, going down into Jamaican lingua franca language and sort of throwing a punch
she's-
at others in a
She's
dancehall
a soldier
fashion.
for Jesus now,
Yes.
right? And I
A
just
dancehall
thought,
is show.
let me finish this book before somebody else gets incarcerated, finds the Lord, or...
Well, we're doing the work. So there's a lot of work that is coming out in terms of looking at dancehall culture and not just in Jamaica, but the kind of global reflections on dance and the trans-global movements in dancehall culture and how other actors who are not Jamaican, not Caribbean, not black are also now being authenticated
In Japan,
inside
right?
of the culture,
The
all over
advent.
Europe.
Yeah.
And so we have, for example, we have a new dancehall queen competition. We have Queen of the Mecca, that was Saturday. I was a part of it. Where we have, you know, an international and a national side. And we still have the other dancehall queen competition in Montego. It pulls in a lot of actors. We had women representing, I think, 10 or 12 countries in the competition. Japan was a big contender.
Yes.
Mexico, Panama.
So
Sweden,
Japanese
Germany,
woman actually
Greece,
won dancehall queen,
right.
which
So
was
it's a very important
it's a
thing.
global,
So it's a lot of work. But
yeah.
yes, so
It's a global phenomenon.
but the
certainly.
patriarchy and the gender conversation
It's there. It's in there. I
and
promise
it's
you.
in the book,
It's
right?
in
So it's
there.
there.
It's in there.
All right.
Any other
Any other question before we
I think we
wrap
have
up?
time for one more.
Yes.
I want to say thank you so much. This has been amazing. And my question has to do with I'm Dominican, and I have been following the Dominican dembow.
Dembow.
Dembow, yeah.
Yes.
And you know, in the I'm not quite sure, and I haven't been able to really study the connection with Jamaica and the Dominican Republic because I think it's probably more like in the last 10 years or more that dembow has really exploded there, and you know it has become the voice of the people, of the poor, and of the disenfranchised and women, of course, and the fact that women are now like Lakeisha and people like that, Tokisha, are talking, you know, about sex and all these things that you would never have this in the Dominican Republic, and you know, for a very long time, mainly because it's a Catholic country, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm really interested in, have you looked at it at all? Do you know anything about the real connections? I don't know if the connections are coming through New York, with the Dominican, Dominicans in New York that are closely connected with Jamaicans in New York. So I would just be interested in hearing from you.
Well, and that's why my newest book, Dancehall Queen, is in English and Spanish. It's a bilingual book because there are many Latin American and South American people, actors, dancers, artists, and the forms of music cultures like dembow that are directly connected to dancehall culture. A lot of it has to do with the United States of America as a kind of location where actors can come, the cross-fertilization across borders, and then take it back. So we've been working with people from Venezuela, Cuba, Mexico, Puerto Rico, Chile, Costa Rica, quite a few people. Panama, I have a whole network of, Spanish-speaking Caribbeanists, Colombia, who are working with dancehall culture with the different forms, reggaeton, dembow, quite a lot of forms, and trying to look at the connections from Jamaica to the US, back to many of these areas, as well as the connections from Jamaica to Panama, to Costa Rica, and then across these networks. So we're actually doing a kind of mapping with my Venezuelan and Colombian partners to sort of pull out that mapping, but also recognizing, very importantly, the contribution and the relationship with the community of individuals in countries that are Spanish-speaking countries with dancehall culture and the female aspects, the women, the dancehall queen, the dancers, the choreographers, as well as the musical artists, and how that has developed. It's a very big and very important connection that we are doing. So that's one of the reasons why my new book is in English and Spanish simultaneously, so that people like yourself and others who are not primarily English speakers can access the information. And one of the things we did on the Dancehall Archive during COVID, we published an article about dancehall, Dancehall Origins, History, Future. We translated it into Spanish. So it's on the website for free, so Spanish speakers can get information about dancehall culture's history and some things that are important about dancehall in Spanish, so they have that access as well. So I'll give you an art little card that you can look at the website and see some of the things on it.
Please join me in giving a warm round of applause. Thank you.
So the book is in, the bookstore is still open?
Yes, it's on.
No. Yeah, a few copies of Passbook are in the shop. I have a few copies of Dancehall Queen. I think there's some of them there if you want to purchase a copy, especially for people who speak Spanish. Right, so we're in the shop for Passbook, online as well. And thank you all for coming. I really enjoyed it. We could be here for next year. Thank you.